Perfect. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Branavan Tharmarajah, Head Project Consultant at the Growcer, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. Today, I'm excited to be speaking with Blair Mirau, CEO of Gitmaxmak'ay Nisga'a Society. Last year, they launched a year-round container farming project in Prince Rupert, one of the rainiest and cloudiest cities in Canada. We'll be talking about what the process was like and key considerations for getting their project started. Before we continue, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, feel free to type your question into the question tab on the side of your screen. First, we're going to play a short video introducing you to the community. Then for the first half of the webinar, I have some questions prepared, and we'll have an additional 15-minute Q&A at the end. Today's webinar will be recorded and sent out later this week to everyone who is registered. Without any further delay, let's get started.
The idea for the Growcer project for us actually started with me watching an episode of Dragon's Den. And when I saw their pitch, it checked every box that we needed. We needed something that was space efficient, that was innovative, and that could help us overcome the main issue in Prince Rupert, which is that we're the rainiest and cloudiest city in Canada, so traditional agriculture is not the solution here. So before we purchased the Growcer unit, we had been experimenting growing with vegetables in our 3 hoop houses at our garden center. And we found it, not only was it not space efficient, but it just couldn't meet the overwhelming demand that we were experiencing. When we went out and started to do the research, we realized that the Growcer was not only the most space efficient, but was the most innovative in terms of the technology that they were using to produce as much local food as you possibly could in only a 40-foot shipping container. And I think there was some kind of unique symbolism in the fact that, Prince Rupert is now the 3rd largest port in Canada, and the container really is a symbol for Prince Rupert's economic prosperity. So the Growcer is so much more than just a greenhouse manufacturer. They're with you every step of the way, from installation to staff training to regular support. And so without them, frankly, this project wouldn't have been successful.
This is the first time I've been able to grow food. I've only really grown flowers. It's really exciting to do something different and growing, not in soil. It's completely different. Your hands are very clean in here. I love this unit, the idea that you can grow, 600 heads of lettuce a week. That head takes only 5 weeks to grow. So I'm experimenting with different varieties. I'm picky on what I grow. I need good germination. I need it to be large quickly. So I get to play with a lot of different varieties. This is next week's harvest. So we'll harvest this rack on Tuesday and give it to our subscribers on the Wednesday, and then this side I will harvest on the Thursday and give it to our subscribers on the Friday. So it's a lot of fun to experiment. I have more seeds to experiment with actually too. I'm trying to get lots of purples and reds and make it a lot of fun.
We were hoping to get 50 customers on a weekly subscription, but without any advertising, we had 140 people on our list within a week.
You have no idea how exciting it is to be able to get fresh, locally grown greens. There was a lot of challenges in getting fresh food for the restaurant. It meant that I had to shop every single day, that I couldn't rely on suppliers to bring me the fresh greens I wanted. When you make a good salad, freshness is paramount. You'll never get such good flavor as when it is freshly picked.
So beyond our subscription box that people can enroll in, we're also planning to use the harvest in our cafe that we've just built on site at the Garden Center. We hope to incorporate it onto the menu at Bob's on the Rocks, which is a fish and chip restaurant that we just purchased. We're also hoping to incorporate it in the Port Ed store, which is another enterprise of ours. So beyond the subscription box and retail operations, we're also donating the surplus, and so for the last number of weeks, basically through 2021, we've been donating the surplus to Nisga'a elders in Prince Rupert and Port Edward.
Awesome. That was a great video there, just highlighting some of Blair's project. So it feels like yesterday we had our first conversation about what you wanted to do with the project, and we've come such a long way. And you had awesome ideas around impact and how you wanted to structure the project and what kind of benefits you wanted to see within the community. So just for a quick intro, why don't we start off by introducing yourself and talking about how the idea got started and what were the community goals.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Branavan. So everyone, my name is Blair Mirau. I'm the CEO of the Gitmaxmak'ay Nisga'a Society. I've been with the organization since the start of 2013. Born and raised in Prince Rupert, and so I have no intention of going anywhere. And as far as I'm concerned, this is my dream job. And that video just kind of shows one little reason why. So to answer your question, Branavan, about how the idea started, I would go all the way back to basically the start of 2014. Our board had said we want to get into business in some way, shape, or form. We want to create jobs and revenues for our approximately 1,600 members is who we represent in Prince Rupert and Port Edward. And there was a garden center up for sale. And so we saw 3 greenhouses. And, with the primary objectives being creating jobs and revenue, we also saw at the time, okay, well, there's an opportunity to experiment with growing food, to try to address food insecurity in Prince Rupert. And so a couple of years of experimentation, tomato hanging baskets and veggie starters didn't really get us in a big way. But we partnered with another local nonprofit called EcoTrust Canada in the summer of 2018. And we hired a master's level intern to essentially do you could call it a pilot project, a feasibility analysis of what kind of a larger scale container farm might look like. And basically what we found was we didn't have enough space because our business was already, kind of maxing out the capacity of the greenhouse. But also we didn't have the space to meet the kind of overwhelming demand for local food in Prince Rupert. So those 2 things then made us start to go out on our search for what a new type of greenhouse could look like. And then as you saw from the video, we stumbled across you guys on Dragon's Den, and the rest is history.
Awesome. And then I know there's a few questions that are popping in. So just wanted to let everyone know there's a Q&A option at the bottom of the screens. If you want to ask any questions, don't hesitate. We'll get to the questions as well. So if anything pops up in mind, don't hesitate. Like I know, Blair, you mentioned you were looking at the feasibility of the project. What did you do to evaluate the feasibility of the project idea? I know your board had an idea. The next step was to jump into the feasibility. What did you do?
The biggest thing for us was reaching out to a bunch of different manufacturers. What set you guys apart, and I'm not even sure if you remember this exchange of ours, but you sent me an email and said, here is a return on investment Excel spreadsheet. It's too complicated to explain by email, so I'll call you about it. And that was what changed the game for us, because that spreadsheet allowed us essentially to determine, a very detailed business plan, all of our different expenses, cost of hydro, cost of labor, inputs. We could change all of our different assumptions, but then also we could create different scenarios for our revenues. What were the types of varieties we were going to grow, the types of price points being sold in the local grocery stores, selling wholesale versus retail. Basically doing that detailed business plan allowed us to see that this project was feasible, but all it would take is some outside investment for us to make it happen. Obviously, being a nonprofit, we are limited in our budget.
It's a perfect segue into the next question. How is the project financed, and how did that process work out for you? Because I think a lot of folks are curious on that side.
Yeah, for sure. So for us, we received a grant from an organization called Northern Development Initiative Trust. For people in Northern BC, they're probably familiar with them, but it is a model used throughout BC. Essentially, this trust tries to invest in projects that create jobs and revenues and diversifies the economy in Northern BC. So I submitted your ROI spreadsheet to them. That basically showed them the business plan made sense. And so they gave us a grant for up to, I think it was just under 2/3 of the project cost. Then we also went to our parent government. The Nisga'a are the first self-governing nation, or modern self-governing nation, I should say, in BC. And so they have a business development fund, which awarded us $50,000 fixed amount to do site preparation. And then the remainder of the project costs was basically us using our own equity in our Paul in our office space to take out a line of credit to finance the remainder.
Great summary there on the financing piece. So now you had a board that was looking to do this project. You had a primary feasibility study kind of done, and then next you had the financing portion. Outside of that, what do you think was a factor in the success of the project coming together?
It really was taking a long time to build that consensus. I mean, it was a span of 4 or 5 years from the garden center purchase to our pilot project. And that's what really sparked a sense of urgency. But over that length of time, there's obviously a lot of hiccups, but nobody really questioned why we were trying to experiment, why we were okay with failure. Because basically, if our objective was jobs, revenue, and addressing food insecurity, this project really weaved all three of those things together quite seamlessly. So it all started with basically a 3-year strategic plan, which turned into a 5-year strategic plan. So yeah, nobody really ever entertained the thought of why would we stop pushing down this road if we're facing obstacles, because we saw the mission and vision of the society being really aligned with the project.
And I know you mentioned that there was it was a lengthy process to sort of get into the execution of the project. I know a lot of nonprofits and even communities that are thinking about bringing this project forward. They're looking to maybe convince their chief and council or their board of directors. How did that process sort of play out for you?
Well, for the last number of years, when we've done our strategic planning process, we've used the acronym is VMOSA, which is Vision, Mission, Objectives, Strategy, and an Action Plan. And we've really asked our board to focus specifically on vision, mission, and objectives, and then let staff flesh out the strategies and the action plan. And that basic approach or framework has proven really beneficial to us. We've done it in 2 very different ways. So it first started by we would host an all-day session with the board of directors, 8 hours long in some cases, catered lunch. You'd sit down and get all of your ideas out on a page. The tough part about that is, how do you set your different priorities and your different timelines and your budget allocations? So what we did then in the last few years is we actually took whatever the board had come up with in that 8-hour session, and we brought it to all of our staff and then all of the community at large. So it's an open invitation. Everyone can come in, they can upvote what the things that they like. They can tell us if they think it's a short-term or long-term priority. And then we took that even one step further. Instead of just generating a basic report, here's our 5 goals and sub-objectives and everything, we actually hired a graphic facilitator to draw it for us. And that conceptual form was much more, I think, culturally appropriate. It really helped people visualize, if our main goals were economic development, food insecurity, language and culture revitalization, all the different kind of, mission and vision, how did things tie together short-term versus long-term? How did the different puzzle pieces fit together? So yeah, it was just a lot of trial and error since 2013. So it's a long time coming.
And then just for folks on the attendees over here, curious, what other businesses is a society operating? Because I know you mentioned it a few times. And where does the Growcer sort of play into that overall vision and sort of image that you're painting?
It's a great question, and sometimes I forget. So I might reference. I have a little chart on my wall because I sometimes do forget. So the garden center was our first purchase. It was essentially, imagine a little 1,000 square foot store falling down, plus 3 about 100 foot long hoop houses, and then also a small lawn cutting division. So just 2 guys in a rusty old Ford F-150. That business was our sole focus from basically 2013 to 2018. And so now we've since expanded from 4 employees to, I think, 16. And so the hydroponics greenhouse fit perfectly as our 4th greenhouse. That's essentially how we've treated it. It's the one that's exclusively dedicated to vegetable production, whereas the 3 hoop houses now are focused exclusively on bedding plants and hanging baskets and more typical garden center products. We also, getting deeper into the kind of local food scene, we did purchase a little neighborhood convenience store, so we can kind of act as our own wholesaler for different types of dry goods and foods. We also purchased a fish and chips restaurant most recently, like a little food truck, which we're hoping to incorporate some of this hydroponic greens on the menu at some point in the near future. And then I am forgetting one. And then we have a floral shop downtown, which was a logical spinoff for the garden center. And yeah, so some hopefully future plans here. We did build a or a cafe into our new garden center when we redeveloped the store. Hasn't opened because of COVID's very intense restrictions on in-person dining, particularly in British Columbia the last few months. But that's the last, I think, food-related business that will be opening here. So all these things tie together, and those hydroponic greens will be able to be used in all of them.
And then once you set up the grocer system itself, how was the site preparation process like? I know you mentioned you had a lawn center. Where's the container located? How did the whole site prep process look like?
So we had a bit of a challenge with site preparation. In Prince Rupert, there's really a lack of large commercial land. So our property is about a half acre, but that has your 3 greenhouses, your store, and a nursery on it. So we actually leased an adjacent parcel from the municipality, and we carved out, basically doubled the size of our parking lot, and we put the hydroponics greenhouse at the very back of the parking lot. In my kind of simplistic terms, I thought the site preparation part would be the easiest. I thought it was just basically level the parking lot, hook up the electrical, hook up the water, hook up the data, and you're done. I underestimated that a little bit. But I would say, just generally speaking, site preparation, the location was not necessarily the hardest part. It was how do you make sure all the utilities speak to one another and incorporate into the existing property. So yeah, it was not as straight line as someone might want to be led to believe, just leveling a flat piece of ground and throwing a container on it.
And then for your sort of process of site prep, is there anything that you would do a bit different than you've initially planned? Because I know working with different communities and even nonprofits like yourself, like you might have one contractor that says you have to do X, Y, and Z. You might have another one that says you have to do it this way. How is your overall process like in terms of vetting through that process?
Well, so we really wanted to source local. So what we did is we sent all the specifications to the local electrical firm and a local contractor that we were using. And the prices that they put in, I think, were quite reasonable. But they both did make the caveat, obviously they've never done anything like this before, so there might be overruns or hiccups or whatever have you. And we did run into a few big ones, and most notably was the electrical capacity on site from BC Hydro was not sufficient, so we needed to buy a new transformer. That blew our budget out of the water. The only way we really could have predicted that would have been to call in BC Hydro and say, this is what we're planning to do. Do you see any obvious shortcomings? They could have identified that, and we could have built that into our pricing. It had to happen one way or another. It just wasn't in our original budget. So that would be my biggest piece of advice, is make sure you've got not only your local contractors, your electrical and your general contractor, get your power supplier on board. Water hookups were generally pretty easy. You just want to get a good understanding of where your feed lines are going to go, if they're going to come off your existing tee like ours did, or if you need a brand new municipal supply, or maybe you'll be trucking in water depending on where you are. So getting all those service providers and utilities on board is important.
Yeah, just like Blair mentioned there, you could either use like an insulated garden hose or give a water truck for some communities. And then you could also look at potentially doing a direct line. I know it was a lengthy process from the planning to the implementation. What kind of support did you see from Growcer, and what was the most important for you?
I can give you 2 answers to that, if that's all right. One of them was, I referenced it before, was your help in the business planning and analysis, particularly through that ROI spreadsheet, I think was crucial for us to get funded. So we wouldn't have got anything off the ground without that piece. So that to me was crucial. But then in terms of the actual implementation, the on-site training during the initial install, you guys actually sent out your CEO. I don't know if you do that for every install, but for us, that was a big boost of confidence for our staff. to come out and have a full week of on-site training to get that thing initialized. Because when the container got dropped by the crane, the water gets hooked up, the electrical gets hooked up, the lights turn on, and we look at it and go, we have no idea what we need to do here. So to have Corey and his team, that was a huge piece of the puzzle for us.
Yeah, with every installation, every project that we sort of implement, our goal is to show up on site, provide all the necessary training like we did for Blair and his team to ensure that the project's successful. That is definitely a key component of the implementation process. And I think there's a few questions here that are more centered around produce and pricing. So we'll jump into that portion right now. So now you're successfully implemented the project. What kind of crops are you growing? And what's your distribution model like? Where are you selling? Who are you selling to? What price points?
I'll answer that in reverse order, if that's all right. So the distribution model that we settled on was actually exclusively direct to consumer. And the reason we did that is because Prince Rupert is so rural and remote, our primary competition for fresh greens really is either the Lower Mainland in Vancouver or it's California. So going direct to consumer allows us to charge a little bit of a premium because people are going to get something from harvest into their fridge within 24 hours. It's just not physically possible to do that with any of the other competition in town. And so figuring out that distribution model, we actually got a grant from the province through I think it's the Indigenous Agriculture Development Fund, something like that. And so that consultant really helped us flesh out what a direct consumer model looks like. So the two price points we settled on was for essentially a small and a large insulated grocery bag. It roughly works out to $15 for a small, $20 for a large. And you can choose as a consumer, do you want to pick up every week or every other week? So in essence, we have 4 subscriptions, a weekly small, a weekly large, a bi-weekly small, a bi-weekly large. So once we had figured that out and we had those price points, trying to match closely what you would get at the grocery store, but obviously the small premium that, this is all, we can't say it's organic because it's not grown in soil, but we can say it's non-GMO, it's all natural, no pesticides, no herbicides. And so in terms of the varieties now, to get back to that question, we've kind of tried to focus on getting the most popular products in the bag every single week. So we had done a couple of community-wide surveys. Wouldn't be any surprise to anyone to hear that, your kind of classic romaine lettuce, butter crunch lettuce are right near the top. Spinach has been quite popular. Bok choy has proven to be surprisingly popular in Prince Rupert. Not a lot of people have had experience growing it. And it is kind of, so to speak, a mystery box for most consumers. You are going to get the same 2 or 3 varieties most times, but we're not allowing people to have the customization to choose their specific varieties each week. It would have been too logistically challenging for us. So that was basically how we settled on the distribution model, was trying to grow the tried and true varieties, supply them on a regular basis, and then consumers come down to our garden center on a weekly and bi-weekly basis.
I know we chatted about this a few times before as well. So how did that community engagement piece go? I know initially you were looking to do, you had a clear idea of how you wanted to sell a bit to wholesale and maybe a bit of a distribution model, but then you did a community engagement sort of activity and you realized you wanted to switch the model. So how did that work out?
Yeah, no, I appreciate the reminder because stuff has gone by so fast. So we were originally thinking of doing about 25 to kind of 40% wholesale to basically to restaurants in Prince Rupert. But what we did was we put out 2 different Zoom consultations. One was an afternoon and one was an evening, basically to ask people's feedback. What are the types of varieties that you would be most attracted to? What days of the week would work best for pickup? What else did we ask? Price points, just basically trying to do some direct consumer business planning. And then at the very end, we said, if you want to get on the wait list, if this is something you're interested in putting a deposit down for, email us and we'll put you on the list. I was honestly hoping for about 50 people. We wanted to roll it out to 40 to 50 people to start, just to experiment. And without a single cent of advertising after those 2 Zoom meetings, we had about 140 people on our waiting list. And so what I essentially said to a couple of our really committed restaurateurs was, I don't think we can actually do wholesale. It would be easier and more predictable for you if you just subscribe to the direct-to-consumer model, pay the same prices, and we'll deliver you however many bags you want. And we've only had 2 restaurants take us up on that offer, but now we are exclusively direct-to-consumer. So it wasn't exactly what we had planned to start, but the overwhelming demand was something that we absolutely had to respond to.
That's great. And then for the second portion of the project where you're building out your project team, who did you look for in the community? How did you find the operator? How was the process of interviewing and training look like?
I can't say that our process for finding an operator is applicable to everyone. We got incredibly lucky where I got a phone call out of the blue from the president of our local golf course, who had said, "Hey, we just hired a new greenskeeper. His wife has some greenhouse experience, and they're not going to move here unless they can find her a job." So I said, "Sure, tell her to fire me a resume, and we'll see what we can do." And this was before we had actually got the grant for the hydroponics greenhouse. And turns out she's got her Bachelor of Horticulture and years of experience managing greenhouses. And you saw in the video there, she said, point blank, this is her first time growing food. She is being a bit modest. She has grown, a lot of different veggie starters, a lot of different flowers. She understands, scheduling is really the most important thing, is getting your crop scheduling done. She's done the softwares before. So we got so incredibly lucky in who we hired. And essentially what we were looking for, the most important quality, was someone who was willing to learn more than anything else, willing to experiment, willing to fail. That was one of the big pieces. We knew there's some stuff that's not going to germinate. We knew that there was going to be some hiccups with the distribution model, with our software system, what have you. We needed someone who was willing to adapt and roll with those punches. And Crystal has been, key to the success of this project. I can't speak highly enough of her efforts.
And I know you mentioned a bit about our Corey, our CEO, showing up for the installation and the training. How is that training process or the week of training like for you and your team?
Well, when the container was first delivered, I think we were all a little bit overwhelmed, and we didn't really know entirely where to start, because there is, as simple as of a system as you guys have built, there are a lot of moving parts. Between your water tanks and your trough system and where you're doing your seeding, and it was to the point that when we looked inside, we turned on the lights, we were a little bit overwhelmed. We didn't entirely know what to do. By the end of that week, though, Crystal was basically committed to trying to grow as fast as possible as soon as Corey was on a plane and heading back to Ottawa. So I mean, without that on-site training, maybe you could have got around doing it remotely in the context of COVID, because just for participants on the call, our install or our delivery was July 2020 and our training was August 2020. So we were right in the middle of the pandemic. You could have gotten away with doing Zoom training, but it would not have had anywhere near the same impact or the ability to boost our confidence internally, just by asking the small questions that might not come up in any type of manual that you guys would write. Maybe just like a valve didn't turn all the way, so what do we need to do there? Just the simplest things that he just helped build our confidence on.
So we've talked about the planning portion, the feasibility. We talked about the training aspect. So what has the impact of the project been so far from a communal perspective, from the nonprofit itself? Just overall general feedback from the community. What are you hearing?
So there's kind of two sides to that coin. I think the obvious impact on the community is now the number of fresh greens that are going out to the community on a weekly basis. We still have a waiting list, but we've tried to onboard as many customers as we can fit, depending on however many, if they want a small or a large. The impact there has been overwhelmingly positive. We did do a subsequent survey of I think it was the first 60 customers we surveyed after a couple of weeks of pickups, and we got some really great feedback from them. So we did make a couple of adjustments to our distribution model, to the way that we stored to certain varieties. And more often than not, people were just asking for more information. What are the types of varieties? Can you recommend types of recipes? those types of things. But Adrienne Johnston, who the restaurateur who's featured in that video, she has been texting me almost every week when she picks up her greens to say, this is what I made for lunch today. This is what I made for dinner today using your greens. Here's my feedback on the kale. It had a very aggressive, sharp taste. It's really delicious. Thank you. Okay, this type of butter crunch lettuce worked really well compared to the variety that I got last week. So that impact has been overwhelmingly positive. And then from the community at large, we have been donating the surplus harvest to Nisga'a elders almost through the duration of 2021. And the feedback there again is quite positive. We're giving them away for free because we want to kind of use it as a marketing tactic, but also it's a really good way for people who might not otherwise have access to such good quality produce to get access to it. We're giving it away through our nonprofit offices. So yeah, there's always hiccups, and there's always a couple of naysayers who might have a complaint here or there, but generally speaking, the feedback has been overwhelmingly positive, and we hope to continue that moving forward.
Perfect segue into the next question here. What are your long-term goals for the project?
Oh, that's a great question. It's hard to say. Right now, our short-term goal is get everyone off the wait list and enrolled. The next piece really is find an equilibrium with the actual operations. Right now, our operator, she's going to go on her first vacation here in July, having been growing basically consistently for 6 or 8 months. So we need to figure out a bit of a plan there before we were ever to expand. But I think the long-term goal, if I could summarize it in one sentence, is how do we get as much local food onto as many local plates as possible? And so we're working on another grant from the province of BC called the Supply Chain Resiliency. And that what we saw in the context of the pandemic in Prince Rupert, being at the end of the line on Highway 16, there was a mass rush in the grocery stores when all these pandemic restrictions were first put in place in March. And we saw empty produce shelves left, right, and center. And so this grant with the province is how can we look at, northern BC, traditional agriculture might not necessarily be the solution, particularly in Prince Rupert, because we don't have agricultural land. It's raining 300 plus days a year. It's overcast the rest of the time. But there is a huge abundance of natural seafoods. And then in the interior, you have things like moose and elk. You have, a whole bunch of other type of culturally iconic species. And where we're located is, if anyone's familiar with the Grease Trails, I would say outside of the Silk Road, the Grease Trails were one of the greatest trading networks in human civilization before European colonization of North America. And the Grease Trails are in reference to the Ulukin, which is, again, a culturally iconic species for the Nisga'a, where that you could essentially create a grease or an oil out of the candlefish, and you would trade as far north as Athabasca. So our long-term goal is how can we revitalize those grease trails, combining the natural abundance of all these culturally iconic species, salmon and halibut and scallops, combine them with our hydroponic greens, and then start to trade with some of these interior nations. That's really what we want to see long-term, is how can we get as many parts of local food onto as many local plates as possible.
That was a great response for the portion there. One sort of question leading into, I know we talked about some of the risks with the site prep. If you could go back in time and tell yourself one thing about getting started, what would you say?
Budget more than 10% for contingency, if I can be that blunt. Going back to, so we've done a couple of different development projects in Prince Rupert, and generally speaking, we've done a contingency budget of 20%. Kind of best practice. I only did a 10% contingency for this because I was a little bit naive and thinking, all right, how complicated is putting a container on a truck, driving it here, craning it into place, leveling the ground, connecting to electrical and water. To me, that wasn't rocket science. But there are still so many things that can go wrong in that context. So that's what I would tell myself circa the start of 2020 is budget 20% like all your other projects, because it's better to be safe than sorry.
That's great advice there. And the next question was, what advice would you give others that are thinking about starting their own project?
Consult early, consult often. You don't want to have to be fighting an uphill battle within your own team or your own community to make a project happen. Try to build that consensus first before you do anything else. I would not necessarily recommend you let it take 5 years. We didn't really have a big sense of urgency at the time until we saw what was possible. And now I think it's kind of put us into high gear. But that would be my starting advice. The other piece would be, don't hesitate to reach out to the grocer and ask for not just the specifications, but the ROI spreadsheet I had mentioned. That will really help you conceptualize what's possible. You'll be able to run a whole bunch of different scenarios. If you consult with your community and direct to consumer is not the model, then okay, you have to adjust your price points and focus on your restaurants or your grocery stores. Every context is unique, but the beauty of doing that detailed business planning is you can try to adapt your unique context to a business plan that will fit.
Great advice, especially on the planning portion there. That's definitely something crucial, because a lot of communities, depending on where you're located, the pricing might vary, crop selection might sort of vary. So that's definitely crucial to put together a plan and then move from that step forward. So now we'll move on to some of our questions here. So if you have a question for either Blair or myself, please type it into the questions tab on your screen, and we'll start running through some of those questions here. So the first question for Blair is, how did you price the produce for your consumers? Was it market price, higher, lower?
It was slightly higher than market price, which we defined as the grocery store retail prices. So being exclusively direct to consumer, we knew we had quite a few unique elements or unique selling propositions, to use the business planning term. I mentioned it earlier, but you can say you're all natural. You can't say you're organic because you're not in soil, but you can say grown without the use of herbicides and pesticides. So we knew we could charge a slight premium compared to what the grocery stores were charging. We also think there's something unique about coming down to a garden center or to your container farm and picking up your produce from the person that grew it. There is something unique there. So we knew that consumers were willing to pay a slightly higher price, and that was borne out in some of our community consultations to start. I don't have an exact percentage for you, percentage above market price, but the way that we actually set our price was setting a small and a large size. We said, okay, generally speaking, we want our small size to be 4 to 6 units and our large to be 6 to 8 units, depending on the size of the head of, whether it was lettuce or kale or whatever, using our best judgment on 4 to 6 and 6 to 8 units. And then going by the grocery store prices, you're looking basically $3 per unit, roughly. So that was how we established $15 for a small and $20 for a large. And then there's no difference in price whether or not someone picks up weekly or bi-weekly, because as far as we're concerned, we're getting the same unit price no matter how many times someone picks up. Bi-weekly, we found, I actually stole that model from our lawn care division, because there's so many people that, whether it's a budget constraint, they don't want to be paying a weekly lawn cut. Same case here, they might not be able to eat, a weekly distribution of 4 to 6 units, especially if you're a single senior, for example. So a bi-weekly option is for that budget conscious consumer or that single household. And yeah, I think that gives a pretty good understanding of where we did our price. The other thing I would add is it was really helpful for us to have, we'd hired a consultant through a provincial grant, and he was able to basically say, consider even though you're an urban container farm, consider yourself a community supported agriculture like any other farm would. If you wanted to offer delivery, don't consider yourself a delivery business, farm that out, ask people for an extra price premium if they want delivery. Your unique selling proposition is people can actually come down, interact face to face with who's growing your food. People don't be shy about charging a slightly higher price. But we aren't that, ultra premium drop to your doorstep 5 seconds after it's harvested. So, I mean, there is some balance. You're not going to charge $10 for a head of lettuce and get very many people.
And then jumping into that portion there, was it easy for you to differentiate with the produce that was sold at the grocery store in sort of like quality, taste? How did you differentiate that? Like for an average community member or consumer that's looking at buying this or that, was it easy for them to see the difference?
I think the main thing people always compare it to, whether you like it or not, is a garden salad. And so that was the way I think a lot of people conceptualized it. So when we did our first rollout, particularly the small box with only 4 or 6 units, if we didn't have, you know, really large heads of something, people would look at it and say, okay, well, I can go to the grocery store and buy one of those plastic containers for $4 or $6, and I'm going to get, you know, half as much. So therefore, if I just went and bought 3 of these salad mixes from the grocery store, theoretically, I would get more. And we heard that loud and clear, and that's why we made some adjustments, because I think that's where most consumers go to is I can buy a, you know, cut bag of, you know, spinach and kale and butter crunch lettuce as a salad mix for a cheap price in a disposable container. Really, that's not what we were aiming for. We're really trying to get people something directly from harvest into their fridge that they can use for any other purpose. So we're not cutting up our butter crunch lettuce into leaves. We're letting people do whatever they want with it.
So another question here. What were the alternative technologies that we were thinking about before finalizing on the container farm?
So we had proven basically in our feasibility project back in 2018 that a hoop house with benches was not feasible. So we'd analyzed doing a hoop house actually growing straight in the ground, either with raised beds or straight in the ground. And we found actually when we were running the numbers, you have the same problem, is that you're not going to get consistent, stable supply, and you can't really be space efficient in a way that actually gets you a return on investment to do this from a perspective of actually breaking even or making money. The only other technology that we really looked at was what a vertical hydroponic farm could look like. Ultimately, we settled on the trough system because when we saw how much the grocery unit could produce, that really helped us settle the business plan. So the horizontal trough system was all, I mean, once we made that decision, it was easy from there.
Perfect. And I think there's a question here on more of the community profile. What's the population within the community? I know you mentioned there were 140 folks that signed up for the community food box. What's the total population? What are the demographics like?
So the city of Prince Rupert is about 13,000 people. About 40% identify as Indigenous. And so Prince Rupert is on Coast Tsimshian territory, made up of the majority being from the communities of Lakolam, Smetlakatla, and Kitkatla. Being a Nisga'a organization, we're operating somewhere that is not our traditional territory. But with that said, there are still about 16 or 1,700 Nisga'a citizens in Prince Rupert and neighboring Port Edward, which is a small village of about 450 people, kind of a bedroom community, so to speak. So that's kind of the rough demographics. We are home to the 3rd largest port in Canada, so there is quite a bit of income disparity. There's a big population that still collects government transfers on a regular basis, but there is also a significant, sizable portion of the population earning over $100,000 a year, being involved in some type of port-related industry.
And there's a few questions around how are you packaging your produce? How are you distributing it? How does it look like when a customer gets their produce every week?
I wish I'd brought an example. Basically, we bought an insulated grocery bag, and we did it in 2 different colors, specifically so we could say, okay, our black bags are our smalls and our brown bags are our large. And then we have a brand that's called Yaga. And Yaga is the Nisga'a word for being at the base of a hill, which describes perfectly where our hydroponics container is. So this Yaga logo is printed against the insulated grocery bag, And when people enroll, they put up a $20 non-refundable deposit that allows us to go buy 2 insulated grocery bags on their behalf. We give them one their first week, and then every week thereafter, they swap out that branded insulated grocery bag.
Awesome. And then with respect to, I know there's a couple of questions around, I know you mentioned you were growing with different technologies. How is the produce from like a container versus, I know you've grown traditionally with hoop housing and things like that. There's a question that's more around the comparison of the quality of the produce.
Mm-hmm. So for us to meet kind of our volumes, we have been harvesting stuff a little bit smaller than you would find in the grocery store. So the leaves wouldn't be quite as large. We've had a little bit of a technical issue in our CO2. And so if you're injecting CO2, essentially that's supposed to increase the leaf growth. We haven't been doing that. People haven't really been making too many comments other than, oh, this is a little bit smaller than what I would find in the grocery store. In terms of the taste though, a lot of people have made the comment of, wow, I've never actually tasted something that's that close to have been harvested. So a fresh green does taste fundamentally different than something that's been harvested in California, has been thrown on a truck, has been driven up north. You know, it sometimes might be a week or two from harvest to it actually going in your mouth. Whereas for us, we're harvesting, you know, the middle of the afternoon on a Tuesday, and you're coming to pick up at lunchtime on a Wednesday. So it's not even 24 hours sometimes before you're putting the harvest in your mouth. So that feedback has been really positive. And then the overall longevity in the fridge has been something that we didn't actually, we knew it would be something that sets us apart from the grocery store, but that actually has been the main feedback that we've gotten when people are comparing us to the grocery store is, wow, I could put your greens in the fridge for 2 full weeks, pull them out and eat them, and it's still fresher than the grocery store. That to me has been really heartening because it allows even more flexibility for people on a bi-weekly basis. If you forget to come pick up, for example, or if you forget that something's in the back of your fridge for 2 weeks, you find it, you're not going to open it up and see a whole bunch of wilty, disgusting, slimy produce. You're actually going to be able to eat what's in there. And that's been something that's been really cool to see.
Awesome. And then there's a question around sort of mitigating some of the risk. I know one of the risks you mentioned was around setting up power. And you mentioned that you put a contingency percent of 10%, and you should have put 20. Is there anything else that another community or a nonprofit that's looking at this should consider in that sort of implementation site prep phase?
That would be my biggest feedback. Particularly because in your operational costs after implementation, hydro is going to be your biggest expense aside from labor. Yeah, I can't really go much deeper into that other than to say, if you can get the most detailed specifications to your local contractors as possible, depending on where you are, unless you're in Ottawa, you probably don't have contractors that have a lot of experience installing a hydroponic container farm, particularly in rural and remote communities. So to build that type of rapport with your contractor beforehand so that they're going to be ready and willing to respond to a whole bunch of unforeseen issues, that's incredibly important as well. It's not just the numbers, but it's actually having that relationship so that someone doesn't throw up their hands and tools down and heads off site because they can't figure something out.
Great response. And there's a question here around climate control. I know you talked about this at the beginning, Prince Rupert being one of the rainiest and cloudiest cities. How does a farm actually do with the climate control? How does it actually grow when it's super rainy outside all the time and cold?
You know, what's funny about it is thinking back to your guys' original advertising that caught my eye. You were basically saying, you know, this thing can grow into negative 50-degree temperatures in the Arctic and plus 50-degree temperatures in the desert. And for us, I'm kind of laughing thinking back is we fall like perfectly in the middle of those two extremes. Prince Rupert's weather for the vast majority of the year, we're only like it's a really hot day and really nice and humid if it's 18 degrees. So, you know, it's not huge fluctuations. If there's a couple of days of snow around Christmas, that's a really nice bonus. But being overcast and being really rainy really meant to us that traditional agriculture was not going to work. And so we've been really we've gone now through a significant heat wave that just ripped through BC a couple of weeks ago. We went through some torrential downpours after we had the thing installed in August. It was super rainy in that fall, and we've still had the same consistent weekly and biweekly harvests. I mean, the weather doesn't impact the actual production, aside from maybe you'll track more mud in on your boots, or the fan might run a little bit more when it's super hot. The biggest issue you're going to have is just germination failure. That's going to impact you way more than the weather ever would.
Another question here around engaging with community members and First Nation community members specifically. Is there any sort of feedback you could give with regards to engaging with community members directly?
Well, so on the strategic planning process, I had mentioned we'd gone out to our community to give us their direct input. And that was super helpful. That really helped us crystallize the really crucial importance of food security. The other piece of the work that I failed to mention was there was a pretty fulsome quality of life survey that was done of all 1,600 members. Particularly, it was focused mostly around kind of health and housing indicators, but there was a really small section around food security. And what was really disheartening was to see, I think it was 1 out of every 3 Nisga'a families in Prince Rupert is not eating consistently 3 meals a day. And the number 1 and 2 reasons for that was the cost of food, and then the issues around accessibility of transportation. So not having a car or having a driver's license or having the money for a cab. That was really disheartening for us. And so that type of engagement was super important for us to understand exactly the level of urgency that people were facing in their day-to-day life. In terms of engagement, or sorry, First Nations involvement beyond that, the unit itself is 100% owned by the Gitmaxmak'ay Nisga'a Society. So all 1,600 members are shareholders in that society, are members, and so it is communally owned.
Perfect. We got a couple of minutes left here, so we'll move on to our final questions. Since starting the project, what was the response been like from your board? I know you mentioned the board was interested in pushing towards food sovereignty. What has the response been like?
Not to sound like a broken record, but it has been pretty overwhelmingly positive. We didn't, if I'm being honest, we didn't really fully know exactly what we were getting into. But I mean, we just got a little bit of a news feature from the provincial government for the success of this project. And it's not me sharing that link with the board and saying, you know, hey, everyone take a look. It's the board chair sending it to the rest of the board to say, guys, everyone take a look. This is the type of recognition we're getting for this work. So because we had spent so many years talking about doing something like this, building that consensus, all getting on the same page of how do we weave together job creation, revenue creation, and food security. I mean, really, now that the rubber has hit the road, we're not trying to rest on our laurels, so to speak, but we can sit back and recognize how far we've come. And particularly as a board, they're looking back to say they did take a significant risk. This is not an inexpensive project, and it was something that was completely without precedent in Prince Rupert. It's a very kind of cutting edge emerging technology that's, you know, it's slowly starting to creep into Canada's consciousness in a little bit more of a bigger way. But it's still a significant risk. And they took that risk because they saw the results from our feasibility and our experimentation and our prior failures, and they weren't afraid to fail again. So I can't speak enough about the importance of having consensus at the board table to make a project like this happen. The level of patience that they've had in us as a staff, the fantastic questions that they've asked along the way. Yeah, I can't speak highly enough of them.
And then we've talked about this quite a few times, but just to summarize it off and finalize some of the thoughts here, what has been some of the biggest highlights since you've started this project? So once you think about your container farm, what are the few ideas or thoughts that pop into your head?
The first one for me is Adrian Johnston, again, the restaurateur from the video, just getting unsolicited texts to say, this tastes phenomenal, this is so great, this is such a much needed project. And then to have that type of word of mouth advertising throughout the community has just been so uplifting. There's no one really in the community who's said anything other than we wish you well. You know, I might not be a customer, it might be too expensive for me, I might not even like eating salad greens or whatever, but consistently people are wishing us well and saying this is something that's so necessary, this is the future of food. And so yeah, it's been great to get all those well wishes. The media coverage has been super helpful in making sure our wait list is remaining to be full. And then conversations like these always just, you know, it makes me feel like we're not doing something into the void, that we're not just hidden away in, you know, Northwest BC doing our own thing, that, you know, we might be able to hopefully offer some value to others who are looking to do something similar, or hopefully can even just be an example of, you know, how risks can pay off.
Awesome. First, I want to thank Blair and everyone for joining us today and for all your questions, and a special thank you again to Blair for taking the time. If you're interested in learning more, we're going to have 2 more sessions on Container Farming 101 series coming up on July 27th and August 10th. There's a handful of questions around profitability, as well as financing and things like that, and that would be with Farm Credit Canada, so it'll be a great session to attend for more of those different options around financing your project. And we hope to see you there on the 27th and on August 10th. To learn more about the Grocer in general, you could visit us at www.thegrocer.ca. Follow us on social media. And if you didn't get your question answered today, feel free to connect with us directly. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks everyone.